ahead and get started. And our session today is titled At Promise, Supporting Our Most Vulnerable Students. And so we will be engaging in some conversation today. I am a huge believer that we learn through conversation. And so we will give you opportunity to process the information, but also to engage with one another in dialogue, to be able to reflect on your own practice, and also on the things that we need to shift and change within our own practices to be able to support our most vulnerable students. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So we're going to explore this question of what is necessary in order to create conditions where our most underserved and under-resourced students can thrive. And so we're going to explore a little bit of our own identity. We're going to utilize a learning bridge, partnership bridge that we utilize from the National Equity Project in order to be able to engage in dialogue and conversation, but also to think about the students and the communities that we serve. Learning outcomes for today: explore our identity and mindset and their effect on student relationships. We're also going to deepen our understanding on the impact that we have on suspension and expulsion data. So we will be examining some of our county data. These are ways that we want to be together. And so these are some of the norms that we utilize within our equity department at the County Office of Education. So what I'm going to give you the time to just read through these. These come from Margaret Wheatley's All Social Change Begins with a Conversation. We have included the slides and the slide deck into the chat, and we will also include a link to these ways that we want to be. They're a little bit more in depth that you can read through and utilize with your staff or your students. But we're going to ask you to read through these and then pick one that you want to really focus on for today's session. And if you can please drop that in the chat, that would be great. So just pick one, and then whichever one you want to focus on for today's session, if you can please drop that number in the chat so we can all see it. Thank you, Jessica. Slow down so we have time to think and reflect. Absolutely. Awesome. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is a learning partnership bridge that we utilize from the National Equity Project. And this is this metaphor of mirrors and windows. And so today, as we go through our session, I want you guys to utilize this metaphor of mirrors and windows and looking at our insights into ourselves. So we're talking about our identity is what do we know about our own identity, our belief systems, but also thinking about the things that we are doing to also learn about the identities of our students, of our parents, of our community, of our colleagues, because many times our identity does not align to that of our students. And so this idea that when we are able to bridge both ways of looking to inform our practice, we are then more successful in meeting the needs of all of our students. And when thinking about mindset, utilizing the same metaphor. So as we think about our own mindset about what we believe about students and what students are capable of, how are we also thinking about our students' mindsets, the mindsets that they're bringing from experiences throughout their time in the educational system. So if you're in high school, they've had 8 years of education prior to coming to you. They're coming with certain mindsets into your classrooms and your spaces. And so how are we thinking about their mindsets, but also how our own mindsets might be impacting the mindsets of our students as well. So we're going to start off with a quick video. It's going to be about a 5-minute clip. And then we're going to get into our first dialogue. So let's go ahead and play that.
For over a decade, I have studied young people that have been pushed out of school so-called dropouts. As they end up failed by the education system, they're on the streets where they're vulnerable to violence, police harassment, police brutality, and incarceration. I follow these young people for years at a time across institutional settings to try to understand what some of us call the school to prison pipeline. When you look at a picture like this of young people who are in my study, you might see trouble. I mean, one of the boys has a bottle of liquor in his hand. He's 14 years old, and it's a school day. Other people, when they see this picture, might see gangs, thugs, delinquents, criminals. But I see it different. I see these young people through a perspective that looks at the assets that they bring to the education system. So will you join me in changing the way we label young people from at risk to at promise? How do I know that these young people have the potential and the promise to change? I know this because I am one of them. You see, I grew up in dire poverty in the inner city without a father. He abandoned me before I was even born. We were on welfare, sometimes homeless, many times hungry. By the time I was 15 years old, I had been incarcerated in juvie 3 times for 3 felonies. My best friend had already been killed. And soon after, while I'm standing next to my uncle, he gets shot. And as I'm waiting for the ambulance to arrive for over an hour, he bleeds to death on the street. I had lost faith and hope in the world, and I had given up on the system because the system had failed me. I had nothing to offer, and no one had anything to offer me. I was fatalistic. I didn't even think I could make it to my 18th birthday. The reason I'm here today is because a teacher that cared reached out and managed to tap into my soul. This teacher, Mrs. Russ, she was the kind of teacher that was always in your business. She was the kind of teacher that was like, Victor, I'm here for you whenever you're ready. I wasn't ready. But she understood one basic principle about young people like me. We're like oysters. We're only gonna open up when we're ready. And if you're not there when we're ready, we're gonna clam back up. Miss Russ was there for me. She was culturally relevant. She respected my community, my people, my family. I told her a story about my Uncle Reuben. He would take me to work with him because I was broke and he knew I needed some money. He collected glass bottles for a living. 4 in the morning on a school day, we'd throw the glass bottles in the back of his van, and the bottles would break. And my hands and arms would start to bleed, and my tennis shoes and pants would get all bloody. And I was terrified and in pain, and I would stop working. And my uncle, he would look at me in the eyes, and he would say to me, Mijo, estamos buscando vida. We're searching for a better life. We're trying to make something out of nothing. Mrs. Russ listened to my story, welcomed it into the classroom, and said, Victor, this is your power. This is your potential. Your family, your culture, your community have taught you a hard work ethic, and you will use it to empower yourself in the academic world so you can come back and empower your community. With Mrs. Russ's help, I ended up returning to school. I even finished my credits on time and graduated with my class.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into our first dialogue And as you listen to Victor Rios, Dr. Victor Rios, something that really stands out about his experience and how does that apply to the students that we serve within our schools when we're thinking about our most vulnerable populations is that our kids are bringing all these experiences, culture, and background into our spaces. And so it becomes this idea of like, one, how are we creating intentional ways of connecting with our students so that we can walk in their shoes, so that we can understand exactly where they're coming from and what they're bringing into our classrooms to make those connections. And so as a juvenile court and community school teacher and administrator, vice principal, principal, the one thing that I found about the students that came into our system, and I made it my business to make sure that I interviewed every single child that walked through my doors, is that 9 out of 10 students always shared about how disconnected they were from school and how disconnected they were to the adults on campuses. And so as you begin to think about your role as a counselor, as an administrator, as a district administrator, how are we intentionally creating structures within our classrooms where we can begin to understand not just our own identity, but how that might impact the identity of our students and what they're bringing into our classrooms. So we're gonna have you guys go into dialogue groups, and we're gonna have you guys engage with these 2 questions. How might my identity blur how I see students for what they can contribute instead of what they lack? And how does my identity impact my ability to develop deep and meaningful connections with students, right? And so it's important for us to understand that many times our own identities may not align to the identities of our students. Our students may perceive us to have a different kind of identity because of the way we look. And so it's important for us to recognize that and be intentional about how we are sharing about ourselves, about how we humanize ourselves in front of our children so they can really get to understand and develop those deep and meaningful connections. So let's go ahead and go into our breakout rooms and then we'll be right back. We're gonna give you guys about 8 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully you got to have good conversation with some peers from around the county. And just want to elevate a couple of things that some of you guys might have talked about, something that struck you about your conversation. If you want to just kind of unmute, we'll have 2 or 3 people give a little shout out. How might identity impact our ability to develop relationships with our students?
I'll share. So my name is Rose. I'm an elementary school counselor in Lakeside. And so this is my first time being in Lakeside. I'm born and raised in South San Diego, Latina. And so my identity is very different from that of the community that I'm working in. It's been a culture shock, I think, for me. And I've had to do a lot of learning, a lot of listening, a lot of asking questions, a lot of understanding. And it does impact, yes, it impacts the way I connect with the students, but more so in that in order to help the students, we have to connect with the families and we have to gain their trust. And I think that's been the major challenge for me, in this, how does our identity impact how we connect with students? Absolutely.
And so the more we understand that and the more intentional we are about the things that we do, the entry points that we give families as far as how do they engage with us, the better. Because the more we understand that, the more we'll be able to understand the needs of our students and our community.
I'll contribute, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I mentioned it in our breakout room, just that my identity in terms of my upbringing was parents who were very on me about my education. There was no question about doing your homework, studying, getting good grades. If you got a B or a C, you had to explain yourself. And my identity being raised like that is sometimes I have a tough time. Something I struggle with at times is empathizing with students who, at least far as I know, have nothing tough going on in their home life that I know about, and have, and don't seem to care about their grades, and they're not doing well. I just struggle with that at times. The little voice in my head keeps saying, just do the work. What's wrong with you? And that's something I struggle with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because that's something that I know as counselors and teachers and administrators, we see that a lot from students. And it goes back to this idea of like, how are we checking in with those kids, right? So those kids that are struggling the most within our system, how are we hearing their voice? How are we listening to what their experiences within our schools? Because the reason why we call students pushouts, and the reason why we have Dr. Monique Morris, who actually created a documentary on pushouts, is that utilizing the vocabulary of pushout means that it puts the responsibility on the system, right? A lot of our kids that drop out, so-and-so dropped out, it puts the responsibility on the child, like they chose to drop out, when in reality, the system wasn't able to meet the needs of that child, right? So the system really pushed them out. So I know as a juvenile court school principal and working with students, for 16 years that were coming and getting pushed out of schools, I could see them achieve at high levels because I spent 16 years of my life trying not to replicate the exact same conditions and the exact same systems that they were coming from. Because what I saw was that the disconnectedness from them to school, from them to learning, from them to adults, it was real. And so they had a lot of trauma and a lot of experiences where, their mindset about their learning. One of the questions that I talked about, how I interviewed every child that came through my doors. One of the questions that I asked them was, how do you see yourself as a learner? And the majority of the time, most often than not, it was like, I don't see myself as a learner. I've never been good at school. I don't like school. But that same child, 6 or 5 or 8 months later, was, they were creating presentations, presenting to, assembly members that were coming into our schools to, get ideas of how to have solutions for certain issues that they were seeing within their communities. And so that same child didn't believe in themselves prior to coming, all of a sudden had some self-worth and some views of himself that he could be successful, right? That he could succeed. And so it's important for us to understand that and think about, like, how are we being intentional about listening to the voices of those kids, right? And I say those kids because when I talk to educators across the county, many of you guys have had the same experience. It's like, oh, you work with those kids. Well, what does that mean? Right? What do you mean those kids? And so for me, like my students I would never have changed what I did for 16 years with the juvenile court schools for anything. Like what I saw from a lot of our students was pretty impressive as far as their ability and their ability to succeed and just be like successful with academics. And it just took a relationship with the teacher, a relationship with the counselor, a relationship with an administrator, right? So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next piece, and we're going to be examining some of these data points of pushouts. Sandra, so if we can go to the next slide. Actually, the next slide is actually a video. So to the next video.
American students make up less than 1% of California's public K-12 schools. But a new study by San Diego State University found expulsion rates for Native American boys was 4 times the state average, the highest among any racial or ethnic group.
A lot of focus and attention has not been on this population, yet this is the group that has the highest rates.
Luke Wood is an education professor at San Diego State University and co-author on the study. He says these disparities often result from cultural misunderstanding.
Most educators are woefully underprepared to engage and teach Native American students because they don't understand their culture, their lived social cultural experiences, and so there's a lot of misunderstanding that takes place. So I think it's also important to note then that we're not saying that educators are bad or that they have malintent. What we're really saying is that there's a lack of understanding, and that creates a pattern that routinely suspends and expels Native American students.
When it comes to suspensions, the study found that Native American boys were 2.5 times more likely to be suspended than the statewide average. The rate for Native American girls is more than 1 percentage point higher than the state average. Wood says educators need to do more.
They can engage with their local tribes and have a better understanding of the indigenous communities that they serve, and really that we think can help to alleviate some of that cultural misunderstanding. The second thing they can do is that they can engage in professional learning around implicit bias, around microaggressions, around cultural competency, around inclusive teaching.
The study looked at the 2017-2018 school year. You can see how San Diego County schools fared at kpbs.org. Joe Hong, KPBS News.
All right, so we're gonna examine some of the research that's out there about suspensions, and then look at our suspension data. And so when we look at the research and we see the disparity, the disproportionality for our students of color, our African-American students are 3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled than white peers. And African-American female students are suspended at a rate of 12% compared to 2% for white girls. If you're Black or American Indian with a disability, the likelihood that you will be suspended is astronomical. And so your percentages for boys go up 25% and 20% more for girls. And then Indian American students are 2.5 times more likely to be expelled than their white peers. And what we know about suspensions within our systems is that when we think about implicit biases and we think about how we see our students, these messages especially for our Black African-American students, start very early. Starts before you get them in elementary school. And so there was a study that was conducted by the US Department of Education Civil Rights Office that found that the African-American population of our students within our preschool programs, they made up 18% of the population and demographics, yet they were 48% of the suspensions that were happening in preschool. So when we think about the impact of the messages that we're sending students through a suspension about their ability to be successful, their ability to be able to achieve within our systems, it starts very, very early. And so those of you who are working in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, we're dealing with students that have had years and years and years of messages being sent that have basically told them, like, you're not smart, you don't matter. And so how do we rectify that, right? It's something that we continue to struggle with and we continue to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm gonna give you guys a moment to look at this data. This is San Diego County suspension data. And there's a lot of numbers here, but we want you to pay attention to that suspension rate number. And so what we find is that San Diego County is in line with all of the research that's out there. When you look at the African-American suspension rate compared to their white peers, they are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended in San Diego County. When we look at our American Indian students, they are 2.5 times more likely to be suspended.
Able to provide those services for them.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say, I'm glad National City's there. I went to National City Middle School and Sweetwater, and now I work in San Ysidro. But I think the data keeps pointing out, and it's like we're beating a dead horse. Every single year, it's the same thing. And I'm at a frustration level because the data keeps saying we do not put value on having enough programs and enough personnel to do the outreach for these students. Case in point, I am the only counselor at San Ysidro Middle School. There was 2 of us, one for 7th and one for 8th. Recently, our 8th grade counselor left this last semester. Currently, we're not hiring another person to replace that one. So there's only me dealing with 600 and plus students. Now tell me what I can do in terms of doing an outreach during distance learning. It is just crazy that the data's there, but there is nothing being done about it to create more programs and more personnel in these positions.
I think that also highlights this idea of practice, right? And so when we think about our own practices, when we think about the things that we have control over, is how are we really intentionally getting the voices of these kids? I mean, we have a lot of kids that are really struggling within our system. And many times when we do have entry points for kids to provide their voice, it's the ASB kids, it's the kids that are right in the AP courses, it's the kids that are doing really well, that are connected to the school. but how are we getting the voices of those kids that are being suspended, that are coming to the office on referrals, that are being expelled, that are, right? So what is the voice of those children, and what is their experience within our very own systems? Because if we're not listening to that voice there, then it doesn't matter what we do, the system is going to continue to have the exact same results for those children, right? And so we have to be able to be courageous, to not what Jeff Duncan Andrade calls sanitate, try to sanitize the language of children, right? Because they speak the truth. And sometimes as adults in a system, we don't want to hear the truth because the truth hurts, right? And so we have to be courageous and willing to listen to the voices of those students that really, really are struggling within our systems, because they have a lot to tell us. They have a lot to say about their experiences within our schools, right? So as counselors, you guys get to hear from students firsthand, right? They tell you like which teachers are treating them a certain way. They tell you which, you know, administrators are saying things to them. So how are we as a system changing how we do business with our kids? And that's a loaded question. But when we think about the real work that goes on within our schools and the real work that we have to do, is we need to be able to humanize the experiences of our students and then create action plans that help to really meet the needs that they have, which in many times is the simple connection. I'm not connected to anyone here. Everybody treats me a certain way. Everybody's out to get me. I mean, you guys as counselors hear this all the time, right? So how are we changing that practice? Because we can throw people at the problem, but that's not going to change practice. We have to really look deep inside within us and within our system to be able to create that change. So we're going to go ahead and get into our next session, which is going to bring us to mindset. Did anybody have any last comments on that? All right, here we go. We're going to go to our next section, which is going to be Jeff Duncan Andrade. So we're going to watch a little quick clip, about 3-minute clip, and then we're going to come right back.
As the youngest of 7 kids, I often felt like it was my birthright to complain. And I remember one time I was on one of my adolescent rants, and my mother stops me in the middle of my rant, and she points at the kitchen table, and she fills a glass halfway with water and comes and sets the glass between us, and she points at the glass and she says, half full or half empty. And my mom's was good for those kind of trick questions where there is no right answer, so whatever answer you give is the wrong answer, and that's the lesson you need right now. So I just kind of stared back blankly, and I didn't take the bait. And she says, son, how you choose to answer that question is how you will live your life, because your life will always be both half full and half empty. If you choose to see your life as half empty, if you choose to see your life for all the things that you don't have, you will never fill your cup. But if you can see your life as half full, if you can see your life for the things that you do have, you will fill your cup, it will overflow, and you can share that with others. That's kind of how I think about Tupac Shakur's poem, The Rose That Grew From Concrete, where he describes young people growing up in poverty as the roses that grow from concrete. And you see, the problem in schools is that we largely ignore the concrete, even though those conditions that affect young people before they ever step foot in our classrooms are perhaps the single most important conditions that we have to respond to before we can even start talking about Common Core, homework, or any of these other things that we're measuring and valuing in schools. Now, of all the stuff that I've read, all the experts that I've met with, nothing has more profoundly impacted my work as a classroom teacher in the last 21 years in my community than this film series from PBS called Unnatural Causes. And what Pac points out in his poem is how absurd it is if you're walking down the street with the homie and you see a rose growing in the concrete. And you turn to the homie like, a rose in the concrete. And the homie looks back and was like, yeah, too bad it's got damaged petals. Of course it's got damaged petals, fool. It's growing in the concrete. Okay? But we do this all the time with young people. Okay? We focus on their damaged petals. We see them as glasses half empty. okay? Instead of focusing on their tenacity and their will to reach the sun, seeing them as glasses half full. Now, if we're gonna do that, okay, we gotta understand the concrete a lot better. Now, as the intro said, I'm from East Oakland. I live in a 3400 block. And in 2000,
so what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and have you guys go into breakout rooms again. And I want you guys to think about what you just heard. And so when we think about our mindset and how we see our children, right? What resonated with you about what Jeff Duncan Andrade said? You know, and I have a quote here. He said, "We focus on their damaged petals instead of focusing on their tenacity and willingness to reach the sun." What does this mean for my own mindset? What does it mean for that? What does it mean for the mindset of our systems that we work in? Right? And so how do we see our students through an asset-based lens? Every single child, every single day. So I'm going to have you guys go into breakout rooms. I'm going to stop my share again. And we will see you back here in about 6 minutes. All right, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had some good conversation. I know we didn't have that much time, so I do apologize. We only have an hour together. But want to open up the space for us to share with each other what came up in your conversations.
I think our mindset, hi everybody. I think the mindset that we take growing up, I was just telling Silvia, being Mexicanos, I think we have this set mindset, like the women is submissive and the men, the machismo, my dad was, being one of 11 kids, you kind of, you have to be in this mold of just taking it. And then you see it with the kids coming in, and they have this machismo part, and kind of finding that balance, I think, with them of not putting them in their place, but making them aware. I like the half full, half empty, kind of finding that balance of the truth, telling them the truth part, because it's okay to have that cultural strongness, which we all do. That's what makes us who we are. But finding the when to and when not to, I think of in the classroom or with friends or with everybody else. Mm-hmm. So I like that. That kind of resonated.
Absolutely. How about somebody else?
I was just sharing in my group that, watching that video with the, the rose that grew from concrete, I was just saying that it just feels like right now we are trying to grow a lot of roses out of concrete in this specific situation, and just having to refocus ourselves and tell ourselves, like, we are working with concrete right now, and we have to be very flexible and very understanding and advocate for the students who, their parents might not know the system right now. And a lot of us don't know the system right now, and just, reminding everybody to be understanding and be flexible. And right now is the time to provide support and not try and nail anybody for missing assignments or bad attendance. And, it's just a supportive time. So we have to be the advocates, especially for our English language learners, who are have a whole different set of hurdles they have to jump. So that his speech right there, I just wish I could share it with my whole staff, just like, we are growing from concrete right now, and just everybody take a deep breath.
Dr. Fernandez.
So Jessica McKenna and I were grouped together a moment ago, and I'd like to highlight something that she shared that I really appreciated. So we were talking about how to relate to our students, and how do we connect and give them a sense of belonging if they look different from us, or if we are just kind of trying to find a way to embrace where they're coming from. And we were talking about how to do that. And you shared earlier interviewing the students, and she shared getting to know one another. Like, she talks to the kids about where she's from, what school she went to, and that kind of thing. And we got into talking about what are some ways that we can be relatable to one another. And one way would be like doing things like a neighborhood cleanup, where the staff is invited to be part of the community, and the students and their families and the staff can partake in doing something like that, just to help bridge that divide, because a lot of times the kids think we don't get it, like you don't understand, teacher, right? And I myself am from Boyle Heights, so I'm far away from the neighborhood where I grew up, but it's not much different than the communities where I have taught and I have worked. So once I'm able to get down to the level where they think they're at and get them to see, like, I get it, right? It doesn't matter what their challenges are, odds are I've experienced it. So once we can like get down to common ground and get them to trust us and that our intentions are pure, I think that we can do so much. And Jessica pointed out some great examples of that in our conversation.
Absolutely. When we talk about being authentic with children, right? I know I'm a huge believer in a lot of the research that's out there. I know Jeff Duncan Andrade's work is awesome. But when we think about education and this idea that education is rooted in trust, mutual respect, and authentic care, right? When we really think about that and we think about our most vulnerable students, that's what they need, right? And so we think about and talk about having relationships. And I always, I know we're getting close to our time here, so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to leave you with this. So this is what I refer to my 5 R's with children. Our students need relentless effort from the adults to understand their backgrounds, cultures, and experiences. It's just a given. If we're not taking the time or being intentional about how we are getting to know our kids within our systems, within our classrooms, within our counseling offices, right, then we're not really addressing their most immediate needs and the most pressing needs. Recognizing, acknowledging, and humanizing their experiences and realities within our spaces, right? Listening to them, listening to that voice. This is how I feel about how you treat me. This is how I feel about how people treat me at the school. It's important for us to make sure that we are doing that for them and that we're utilizing spaces that is helping them have a voice, right? And then the last 3 R's, relationships, relationships, relationships. Our kids need to be connected to the adults on campus, even if it's just one adult, but somebody who they have to go to, that they can talk to, that they can relate with, that they can, trust in, because that is, for my personal experience, growing up in East LA, right down the street from where Patty grew up in Boyle Heights, my 8th grade teacher saved my life. Everybody who I grew up with, who I went to school with, is either dead or in prison right now. And so if it wasn't for my 8th grade teacher, a white man, Canadian, hockey loving, everything that you can think of that I did not have in common with, right? The fact that he took time to really get to know who I was and who did not kick me out of his classroom, who, really kind of kept on like being persistent about, just really getting to know me and talking to me, even though I would like shine him off and, curse him out and leave his classroom and, all that good stuff that we see from a lot of our kids. If it wasn't for him, I think I would have been dead or in prison right now, because that's where everybody who I was with at that time ended up, right? And so his genuine trust and his genuine caring for me is what changed my life. So with that, I leave you with this. Students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. All right, and so I invite you guys to join us. Our county office is putting together, actually, we already have it together. This is the 2nd time around, but we created a session called At Promise and Pushed Out. It's coming up in March. We'll give you the link for registration for that. It's a free 3:30 to 4:30 3-part series. You've already seen session 1 today, but if you want to dig in deeper into Jeff Duncan Andrade's work, the Rosa Group on Concrete, the research that comes out of that, and looking at a mindset, and then also looking at how we can change our systems, please join us on March 4th. It'll be a 3-part series, and we thank you for being here today.